Hello and welcome to Weekly Digest with me, Chris Banbury, here in London. This is our chance to see what's making the headlines here in Europe, in North America and further afield. And joining me this week is an experienced journalist and academic, Pádraig Belton, who covers issues from Pakistan, the Middle East and across the world. The first story we're going to look at is the ongoing war in Syria and a seeming escalation in that conflict. From Britain, The Guardian reports Syrian President Bashar al-Assad says civil war is turning in regime's favour. President Assad has said the country's 3-year civil war is turning in the government's favour. Syria's army has made a series of advances in recent months, overrunning opposition bastions near the Lebanese border and in the central province of Homs. This is a report quoting the government's state news agency. From the United States, Times says Syrian rebels appear to have a new type of US-made anti-tank weapon. The recent appearance of an American anti-tank missile in the social media of a Syrian rebel group fighting the government of President Assad raises questions about US assistance in the war and its effectiveness. For months, US security officials have leaked information to journalists about the supply of light arms to moderate rebels in Syria's southern areas and congressional approval for further deliveries. This is possibly the first evidence of American armaments in use in Syria. The Sydney Morning Herald from Australia says Putin defies Obama in Syria as armed flow fuels Assad resurgence. Russian President Vladimir Putin, condemned by NATO for annexing Crimea, is now defying the US in Syria by sending more and deadlier arms to help Bashar al-Assad score a string of advances against insurgents, military experts say. Dr. Assad's army, seeking to end a 3-year civil war, it's killed 150,000 people, have started using long-range Russian Smerch and Uragan missiles for the first time. From Saudi Arabia, Al Arabiya says, sources, US readies to further back Syrian rebels. The US government is finalising a plan to increase training and small arms shipment for Syrian rebels, 2 US security sources said, as Syrian government troops gain momentum following the collapse of US-backed peace talks. The United States will increase insistence and send shipments to moderate rebel factions, mostly based in Jordan, along Syria's southern border. And the Los Angeles Times, also from the States, says Syria rebels blame each other for a reported poison gas attack. Each side in the Syrian conflict blamed the other for an alleged poison gas attack that reportedly injured scores of civilians in the central province of Hama. There was no independent confirmation of a chemical strike, which reportedly hit the village of Kafar Zita, an agricultural centre northwest of Hama. Fierce clashes between rebel and loyalist forces have been reported in the area. I mean, this is now going on for 3 years. We have a huge refugee problem, all sorts of other problems. Do you see any end to this conflict?
I don't, I'm afraid. I don't think it'll be a quick end. I mean, if partly it's also taking on now the coloration of conflict between Russia and the United States by other means, sort of a Vietnam for a renewed Cold War. And that certainly doesn't really bode very well. I mean, on the one hand, you've got Bashar attempting to seize the advantage and claim that he's got it at the moment. On the other, there has been, some curiosity about whether these American weapons came directly from the Saudis, and so only indirectly from the Yanks. But certainly, as well as the Americans, the Jordanians are hoping now to bolster the moderate opposition. There's also a lot of opacity. I mean, you've got Riyadh and Doha both with their favoured bits of the rebel groups. And they're not particularly seeing eye to eye. within the Supreme Military Council, which is, since you would have some place for the coalition, that also has been increasingly rejected by a lot of the rebel groups. So it's really becoming a bit of a terrible mess. And then on the other hand, you've got in Saudi Arabia the succession struggle stepping up for who's going to take the place of King Abdullah, who's not exactly a young man. Prince Bandar had been the head of his intelligence establishment after being a long-time ambassador in Washington, and he was running the Syrian brief for the Saudis. Now he's been chucked to the side. So, where does that leave this?
That's an interesting question, just to dwell in Saudi Arabia, because President Obama's visit to Riyadh quite recently seemed a bit of a disaster. Actually, it seemed to underscore tensions between Riyadh and Washington.
Yes, it's not a relationship that's going terribly well. And at the moment, he's not got. For second-term president, where if you look at his predecessors, ordinarily the temptation would be to go for easy wins in foreign affairs. You look at Clinton and the Good Friday Agreement, ordinarily you're so bogged down by that point in
this is in Northern Ireland.
Yes, then you sort of hope for easy wins from being a statesman overseas. Obama's not had much luck in that camp, between either the Middle East or the way things are going with the Geneva talks beginning today, and with respect to the Ukraine and Crimea. He's not had a very easy go of it.
And I just want to ask, here we have reports of both Russia and America stepping up arms supplies to both sides of this conflict. The cynics might say this is sort of a proxy war, given the conflict between Russia and America over the question of Ukraine. They're playing it's kind of another way of this conflict expressing itself. Would you agree with that?
To an extent. This comes so ironically at the heels of the last year, where Western powers, particularly Washington, particularly London, in the wake of the chemical attacks, have extraordinarily loath to get involved. The back and forth, the dynamic seems to have been that Washington was waiting for the Syrian rebels to sort themselves out. The Syrian rebels, for their part, were waiting for Western empowerment. So this was not exactly going anywhere fast, and it was kind of giving a blank card to both to Bashar and to the more religious elements within the opposition. You've also got, in a way that maybe we haven't quite seen since the Spanish Civil War, you've got a lot of Europeans who are over there. And Peter Newman over at King's College has been keeping in quite good touch with them, because these people are on Facebook. They're on Twitter. They're talking about what they're doing. Most of them, will eventually come back to Britain, and they'll be, perfectly reintegrated members of society. But there are some who will be radicalized by the experience, and they'll be handy with, bits of kit that go bang. So, where does that quite leave us? This is going to go on for a while.
It's an interesting question, because these reports keep saying the Americans are supplying these new anti-tank weapons, heavy weapons, to moderate groups. But how confident can they be that that these weapons will remain in the hands of moderate groups in Syria, and not, as has happened before, be taken by the Salafists or other groups?
That's certainly why it hasn't happened more to this point. It was key, I think, with the decision not to supply shoulder-launched grenades. They were thought particularly, a bad piece of kit to let get in the hands of the more religious groups. I think it does show that Bashar's got the initiative at the moment. That the Yanks are lightening up their line a little bit on this, and so the Jordanians, but they're quite aware of the fact they've got an enormous refugee population at the moment. They're sealing off the border. I think they've even fired on some rebel convoys as they've got rather close, because they're quite keen to contain that, even as they attempt to intervene a bit and prop up the moderates within the rebels.
Yeah, and looking at the Syrian conflict, a friend of mine who was in Geneva during the short-lived talks which took place there said that she'd talked to some of the opposition, and actually they were quite candid. What they were looking for was essentially to carve out their own territory in the north, if you like, to partition Syria. Do you see that as a possible option?
Most likely we will muddle towards that. This doesn't really seem to have produced any quick gains for either side. There is a bit of a stalemate. You have these these odd ethnic divisions within the country, which have always, made it a dicey landscape for the Assads to govern. So, with so much in the world at the moment, it seems to be going towards, partition and carve up.
And looking at this, there were the talks in Geneva. The Russians were, of course, involved in that, and they brokered this deal in chemical weapons, which does seem to have held, actually, despite all the difficulties we're seeing in Syria. But of course, the other country which is intimately involved in this is Iran, which has been excluded from this. Do you think we should include Iran in these attempts to broker some peace deal?
It'd be difficult not to. We do have these wonderful kind of green shoots of a new guy in charge. It'd be a shame not to draw Iran into the process more, and there is certainly a great appetite and yearning, there for greater involvement and reintegration within the world order. Particularly given that within the Security Council you've got the Russian and the Chinese governments sort of stalling any particularly concerted Western attempt to prop up the rebels or call Assad to account. We saw it this week with the torture presentation that was so very chilling, in the way that Samantha Power put it as the US ambassador there. So, in as much as Iran might be an interesting trump card and might actually bring an interesting dynamic into things which are going to play.
I know you mentioned Qatar, which has been playing quite a considerable role, actually, and seems to be exerting itself as a sort of, it's trying to be an influence in the area. What's going on here? Traditionally, sort of Qatar has been seen as a close ally of Saudi Arabia, and wouldn't have done anything independent of Saudi, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
Yes, it is all coming up. This is a country which has got an increased visibility around the world, either in the banking sector or with Jazeera. So it may simply be a matter of seeking more regional power status for itself, I think, and no longer being quite so wedded to a Riyadh security establishment, which seems increasingly difficult to read. It's hard really to say at the moment who's quite pulling the strings. It's certainly impossible to say who will be running the place in 5 years.
In Saudi Arabia. Mm. Yeah, that is a worrying thought. The Saudis are deeply implicated, obviously, in the Syrian. How much influence do you think the Saudis have on the Syrian rebels?
It seems to be strong. They are putting in rather a large amount of money. There are rather a lot of people who've gone over. Though this itself has also come under an odd bit of domestic politics, because you've at the same time you have somewhere in the order of tens of thousands of Saudi nationals who are estimated, by most sources, to be fighting in Syria. Certainly with the connivance and support of sectors of the Syrian of the Saudi state. But you've also had the Home Ministry recently clamp down on this sort of forward adventurism as likely to lead into into religious adventurism and have a blowback effect back home, to the point where the Home Ministry has declared to be illegal. So Saudi Arabia is not speaking with one voice, which makes it very difficult. That's
quite an interesting point. You can clearly see the sort of edit that down. That was getting quite interesting with Saudi Arabia, but anyway. Oops. Pádraig, thank you. We're now going to turn to another issue, which is the prosecution in Pakistan of the former President Musharraf, who's facing charges for subverting the constitution. From Pakistan, the Express Tribune, treason case, Musharraf's lawyer presents notification of 2007 emergency before special court. After Musharraf was formally charged with subverting and circumventing the constitution by imposing emergency measures, his lawyer stated the names of the people who were involved in implementing that decision should also be included in the prosecution. In other words, that Musharraf should not be just simply put on trial alone, and that the people he consulted and acted with should also be in the dock. The Times of India says, Pakistan court indicts former President Musharraf for treason. Pakistan's former President Pervez Musharraf pleaded not guilty to 5 counts of treason, a case brought by the increasingly assertive judiciary against the former military ruler. Musharraf faces the death penalty if convicted of the charges over the suspension of the constitution and the imposition of emergency rule in 2007, when he tried to extend his rule as president. Pakistan Tribune says justice is not blind in Pervez Musharraf's case. Musharraf vehemently denounced treason charges against him as a vendetta, saying he had the full backing of the army in all the decisions. He confidently denied the charges and made his submissions before the court, highlighting the country's achievements under his tenure. He said, "I'm being called a traitor. I've been chief of the army staff for 9 years and I've served the Pakistan army for 45 years. I've given my country my youth, I fought for 2 wars. Is this treason?" The Business Recorder from Pakistan says democracy is still in its infancy. The ground realities in Pakistan indicate that power continues to be wielded by the army in a range of issues that in mature democracies are the domain of the civilian government. In addition, the army has consistently displayed a marked sensitivity towards civilian accountability of retired officers and those in deputation, operating in sectors not related to the army's core business of protecting the country's border and fighting the war on terror. The Economist in the UK says Pakistan's civil-military relations, general unease, politicians defy the once mighty generals over Pervez Musharraf. Ever since Pakistan's third disastrous stint of military rule ended in 2008, with the coup-maker Musharraf slouching off to exile in London, the generals have tried hard to be seen to be getting out of politics. Behind the scenes, the army still wields immense influence, but seems to be being seen to boss around civilian governance is to be avoided. So it's a sign of the army's current unease that its newest chief felt he had to publicly defend the army's dignity and institutional pride. Pádraig, how important is the army in Pakistan politics today?
Yes, you don't really want to annoy it too much. I mean, Kayani spent his entire tenure, which only just came to an end, trying to reassure the public that the army was not going to come out of the barracks again. It wasn't going to storm the centres of power in Islamabad. In attempting to broaden the case, to look at other people, other aiders and abettors of this particular alleged act of treason, of the state of emergency declaration that he did, it's not really clear how far that would go. I mean, is that all the way down to some squaddy standing guard outside a jeep? But what it is clear is that everyone that would draw into the net would be wearing a khaki uniform. So it is an anti-upping device. I mean, Musharraf, the poor man, he's been living in a dream world up until, I interviewed him when he was here in London, and they all do come to London when they fall out of power. Benazir had her places in Syria. Nawaz Sharif was having coffee at a coffee shop, H.R. Higgins, when he got the telephone call saying that he could come back to contest elections again. They all do tend to come here when they're chucked. And he really, in interviews, seemed to think that he was going to be able to go back after the partial successes of Zardari's years, and there'd be this wellspring of support from him. He was promptly arrested. He was allowed at least house arrest, the dignities of that. In the end, it probably will be the called mum to get out of jail free card. It will be the mother ruse. He's got an ailing mum in the UAE. Akram Sheikh, the chief prosecutor, has suggested that perhaps the government wouldn't object to him being permitted to leave the country briefly to go to see his mother, who's not well. this could be the ultimate, the hints of the ultimate end game, because he's certainly looking to bring in as many people down with him as possible, and the army wouldn't be very, very happy with
And
that.
could you remind us the background to his decision to impose emergency rule in 2007?
Yes, there was the whole question about whether he should take off his uniform, his dress choices mostly. And he'd extended his tenure as chief of army staff, not chief of martial law administration, which is the hat that Zia had worn, but he was a serving general at the same time as president, and it was to permit him to set aside the constitution and to put in a provisional arrangement, and to chuck all of the judges who'd been something of a thorn in his side, which is why the quite political now left Chief Justice Iftikhar Chowdhury, who is a thorn in the side of all politicians, who didn't like Zardari one bit, but also didn't like the military and didn't really like Musharraf either. It is still a bit of inertia from his heyday, why the court was going on so strong, pressing these treason charges, which you'd imagine would be a bit of a sideshow. It's, civil-military relationships have reached their own accommodation at the moment in Pakistan. It's not clear it's the most important thing for the country, which has some things to worry about, like the Taliban have just called off their ceasefire. There's the question of, is there anyone within the Taliban, sure, who can speak for the Taliban? Because you've got just like in Afghanistan, you've got a handful of different groups, many of whom don't like the ones who speak for the movement, and they all are motivated by slightly different ideological and practical causes. So it's not really clear that trying Musharraf is actually that important for the country, apart from in a vague historical putting things to rights sense.
The Business Recorder says democracy is still in its infancy. Pakistan has now existed since 1948. It's well over half a century now. But democracy doesn't seem to really work in Pakistan.
It's getting there. We've just experienced the first civilian transfer of power from one party to another. That's huge. It's enormous. In the end, really, Zardari just hunkered down. He didn't even really particularly campaign in the last elections. It was a bit fatalistic. Bilawal, there was the young hope, the son of Benazir and Zardari, was meant to take over sort of the reins of the party, but he was a bit spooked by violence. The Taliban were a bit of a game maker there, because they targeted the secular parties, the MQM, as well as the PPP, quite hard. They targeted the PMLN and Imran Khan's PTI just a little bit less, with the result that one side, the secular side, didn't really campaign. They generally stayed home and tried to not die. And now you've got Nawaz Sharif coming to power with a very safe government that were mostly the people that he had as intimates when he was chucked out in '97 by Musharraf.
This was, just to end on it, this was a key ally of the United States, Pakistan, for a long time, But we now have a kind of a destabilised country, a really very important crossroads in the world. Very, very important, surrounded by neighbours. What happens if Pakistan is going to have a spillover to elsewhere, to its neighbouring countries, isn't it?
Yes, and then you've got, what would be the effect of Modi being suddenly in charge of India? That we've got the elections coming to their pivotal point today. It'll probably be the BJP. This will be a much sterner line from there. There's a possibility for the Indo-Pak relationship to break down and to...
Well, maybe an issue we can turn to next week. I'm sorry, I have to turn now to a familiar story, one which we can't ignore, and I apologise once again we're doing it. But I don't apologise. It is the continued tension between Russia and Ukraine. The New York Times from America says Ukraine falters in drive to curb unrest in the east. Ukraine's failure to enforce its own ultimatums and its appeal on Monday to the United Nations to send peacekeepers laid bare a grim reality for the shaky government in Kiev, where political leaders and security forces have few reliable ways to confront Russian-backed separatists in the rest of the east. A deadline set by Ukraine's acting president for the start of large-scale anti-terrorist operations in East Ukraine passed without any clear military intervention. From Canada, the National Post says, powerless to halt seizures by pro-Russian mobs, Ukraine urges UN to send in peacekeepers. Ukraine's acting president urged the United Nations to send peacekeeping troops to eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian gunmen kept up the rampage of storming and occupying local government offices, police stations and a small airport. The request came from a government that's proved powerless to rein in the separatists, and insurgents have seized or barricaded government buildings in at least 9 cities, demanding more autonomy and closer ties with Russia. From the UK, The Guardian says pro-Russian militias fill the vacuum that Kiev's control in eastern Ukraine slips. With the East slipping out of its grip, Ukraine's Western-backed government has promised a tough response. The defence minister has announced an anti-terrorist operation. One security officer was killed on Sunday, another injured after a shootout with separatists in Slovansk. The deadline for terrorists to hand over weapons came and went on Monday. On the road to Donetsk and Slovensk, however, there was no sign of Ukraine's elusive army. USA Today says Obama speaks to Putin about violence in Ukraine. Obama expressed grave concern about Russian government support for the actions of armed pro-Russian separatists who threaten to undermine and destabilize the government of Ukraine, said a White House statement. Putin, meanwhile, denied Russian involvement in uprisings within Ukraine. Also from the United States, the Wall Street Journal said, the West leaves Ukraine to Putin. Matthew Kaminsky writes from Kiev, 2 decades ago when the Berlin Wall fell, the West embraced another generation of Eastern Europeans. Ukraine has gotten a different welcoming committee. An economically feeble European Union gorges in Russia's energy and dirty money while lecturing Ukraine on Western values but refusing to defend it. Vladimir Putin sees a West made soft by money, led by weak men and women unwilling to make sacrifices to defend their so-called ideals. Pádraig, I mean, Ukraine seems powerless to stop the takeover of the eastern part of its country by these gunmen, by these militias, demanding either greater autonomy or unity with Russia. It doesn't seem to be able to act.
No, they're not really going to win this one. And the thing is, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation for them, because either the Ukrainian government, with what's left of its diminished military capacity after not participating in the Partnership for Peace with NATO under the Kuchma years, so it's got a diminished military to begin with going into this. If they do stand up to what are almost certainly Russian-backed groups in the east, the new People's Council governing Donetsk, then there will be bloodshed. If they don't, there'll be anarchy. Either case gives Putin the green light to go in with these troops that are massed on the border, with this new doctrine that he seems to have assigned himself, which is the ability to intervene in neighbouring nations to Russia in support of Russian speakers. This is a precedent that, if pressed to its logical conclusion, takes him to the oil-rich areas of North Kazakhstan, would. Though these are members of NATO, certainly there are a lot of Russian speakers within the Baltics. It all comes to a head today. I mean, Obama's gone to such lengths to give the Russians an exit ramp at each point. Putin has instead clamped his welly down on the accelerator. In the end, they'll be, I think, reasonably powerless to prevent some form of federalization, which is just a code word for the breakup of the Ukraine and the East folding under the Russian sphere of influence, if not formally integrated, at least along the lines of the Transnistria or the bits of Moldova that are,
effectively part of the Russian Federation.
Happily, for Moscow's mind, housing some Russian soldiers. NATO seems quite clear that they're drawing the line in the sand on NATO members. So the Poles won't be quite happy because they wanted a large NATO army base there. But the rest of, the eastern members of NATO will be reasonably happy because there's a backing up of forces there. Maybe less so in the Black Sea because NATO abides to some conventions regarding operations there. This is also really not the best moment for NATO, which has been fighting with ISAF in Afghanistan in the UK, you know, you've got this quite ambitious equipment plan, the Future Force 2020, which is basically crossing our fingers and hoping that nothing terribly happens in the next handful of years. And then in 2020, you know, there'll be these two beautiful new aircraft carriers.
But just returning to Ukraine at the moment, I mean, I was talking to, or listening actually to an interview with some pro-Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, and they were saying, look, the West rubbishes when Moscow talks about Kosovo and draws a comparison with Kosovo. The West rubbishes this, but actually the parallel is exactly the same. And certainly they seem to be going along with Putin in this idea that really what the West did in Kosovo gives them some justification of what they're doing in Crimea and Ukraine. Do you buy into that?
Possibly. I mean, Kosovo was a muddle, and it's hard really to extract any guiding principles of you know, international law or diplomatic.
But the Russians felt they were betrayed or lied to about Kosovo. That's their take on it.
Yes, as well as sort of a need to perhaps up their ante in being a defender of Slavic peoples, Orthodox peoples overseas. If in this case, not exactly Russians. You know, there's one of a piece of the London Review of Books a couple of weeks ago where a chap went and walked around, you know, and I mean, the Ukraine is a wonderfully divided country. It always has been. The only hope, really, that, you know, it will sort of emerge in one piece, assuming terrible to write off today, but, you know, with the first face-to-face meeting between Kerry, Lady Ashton, and then Lavrov and the Ukrainian foreign minister. But it really is, if the 25th of May presidential elections don't go forwards, then it's really hard to see a united Ukraine really surviving.
I mean, it's an interesting point you make, because I mean, Ukraine has got a very complicated history. The West seems to sort of ignore this, rather like it ignored the history of Afghanistan. It sort of blundered into this. I mean, that's my take on it. This extension of not NATO membership, but European Union association. They didn't seem to have any sort of knowledge that this was a bit of a minefield they were entering into.
It certainly is. I mean, when you look at the polling data, I think the Yanks have the International Republican Institute. They fund sort of congenial political parties to each of the parties. So there's management, Labour, right and left, and they fund allied groups for each. And they've done some polling, and you know, the Easterners and the Russian speakers. There's an extraordinary political divide there. They do want closer relations with the Russians. The touchstones of Ukrainian history are incredibly divisive. You know, the people who the West, the people in Lvov would see as patriots, particular post Second World War figures,
are seen by Russia as fascists.
In the East are seen as fascists.
Pádraig, I'm sorry, our time is now up. I'd like to thank you for joining us, Pádraig Belton. I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I hope you can watch next week's episode of Weekly Digest. From London, goodbye. Went very quickly.